If you're a nonprofit that fundraises in more than one state, you know that the paperwork can feel, well, a little overwhelming. But one of the most critical and honestly often underestimated challenges is just keeping track of all those different filing deadlines. So, in this explainer, we're going to break down why that is and, more importantly, what you can do about it. This explainer is part of our multi-state fundraising compliance series. It's all designed to make these pretty complex topics practical for nonprofit leaders and their finance teams. We really want to thank our friends at Ironwood Registrations for making this whole resource possible. So let's start with a big question. Is compliance just about filling out a bunch of forms? For any nonprofit registered in multiple states, the answer is a huge no. It's really this massive coordination effort. You're trying to track dozens of different deadlines, and each one has its own unique rules, its own cycle, and its own documentation requirements.
And here's the thing you really need to get. Most compliance breakdowns, they don't happen because of negligence or someone ignoring the law. Nope, they happen because of simple, preventable errors. A deadline gets miscalculated, dates get misaligned between departments, or a key renewal just gets missed in the shuffle. It's that simple.
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll navigate what we call the deadline maze. Then we'll look at the common pitfalls and penalties. After that, we'll see how growth actually makes this riskier. And finally, we'll get to the good part, building a solid tracking system and coordinating it with your financials. All right, first up, the deadline maze. You know, when you're registered in just one or two states, keeping track of renewals is pretty simple. But as you grow to 5, 10, or even 20 states, the complexity doesn't just add up, it really multiplies. It gets complicated fast. And this is exactly why it gets so confusing. There's just no universal renewal date. Every state does its own thing. Some deadlines are tied to your fiscal year end. Others are linked to your IRS Form 990 due date. Some states just have a fixed calendar deadline, like, say, December 31st. And on top of all that, you've got different rules for extensions and a whole variety of required financial attachments. It's a recipe for chaos. So all this complexity naturally leads to some very predictable pitfalls and, unfortunately, some pretty serious penalties. Let's take a look at what happens when things go wrong. We see these 4 breakdowns happen over and over again. First, assuming uniformity, just thinking every state is going to play by the same rules. They don't. Second, a fiscal year change happens and someone forgets to recalculate all the deadlines. The third one is a biggie, overlooking extensions. So many people think an IRS 990 extension automatically covers their state renewals. That is a really dangerous assumption. And finally, staff turnover. If your entire system lives in one person's head or in their inbox, you are incredibly vulnerable. The key takeaway here couldn't be simpler. Assumptions create risk. The second you think, oh, this state is probably the same as the last one, you're setting yourself up for a missed deadline. And the consequences of missing a deadline, they go way beyond a simple late fee. We're talking about significant administrative penalties, a public note of delinquency on the state's website, which, yeah, all your donors can see, and in some cases, a temporary suspension of your registration. I mean, can you imagine having to reapply from scratch? And this is just a crucial point. Even a temporary lapse can cause real damage. It can raise red flags for your major donors, it can complicate your grant reporting, and it could even jeopardize corporate partnerships. That's why maintaining continuous registration requires such precision. Okay, now let's talk about growth. Because, ironically, as your organization succeeds and expands, this whole process gets so much riskier. More revenue, more fundraising, more states. It all just multiplies your compliance risk. This really requires a fundamental shift in how you think. As you scale, compliance tracking stops being just some admin task on a spreadsheet. It becomes critical operational infrastructure. It needs to be just as solid and reliable as your accounting system. All right, so we've laid out the problem pretty clearly. Now let's get into the solution. How do you actually build a system to manage all this complexity? Well, the key is to be structured and proactive. An effective system really boils down to the 4 key components you see right here. First, a centralized compliance calendar that everyone who needs it can access. Second, clear internal ownership. Someone has to be responsible for this. Ambiguity is your enemy here. Third, you need documented renewal procedures. This is so important, so that crucial knowledge doesn't just walk out the door when an employee leaves. And finally, regular compliance reviews, so you're always ahead of the game. Last but not least, let's talk about what might just be the most critical link in this entire chain: coordinating your compliance tracking with your financial reporting. This is where we see a really dangerous domino effect. See, many states require your completed IRS Form 990 or your audited financials to be filed along with your renewal. So, if your audit is delayed or your 990 gets extended, it can trigger a whole cascade of late filings across dozens of states. And that's why proactive planning isn't just a nice to have, it's a core part of your risk management. Your finance and compliance teams have to be perfectly aligned. Your audit schedule and your Form 990 timeline, they have to be built with all of your state filing deadlines in mind, right from the very beginning. So this brings us to a final and I think crucial question for you to think about. I want you to take a hard look at your own process. Is your tracking system just a spreadsheet task that one person handles, or is it a core risk management function that's truly integrated into your governance? For any growing organization, it really has to be the latter. So let's wrap this up. Tracking filing deadlines across multiple states is without a doubt one of the most critical parts of compliance. A structured, proactive system is your absolute best defense against missed filings, late fees, and those really damaging registration lapses. So what's the final takeaway here? As your fundraising expands, precision becomes non-negotiable. A strong tracking framework doesn't just keep you compliant, it actively protects your ability to fundraise without any interruption. And ultimately, that kind of strong oversight is what makes sustainable long-term growth possible.